From the Levers reader-supported newsroom, this is Lever Time. I'm David Sirota. Sometimes it feels a lot like we're the band on the deck of the Titanic, trying to keep calm as the ship inevitably sinks to the bottom of the ocean. We're 7 months into Donald Trump's second term as president, and we've already felt the threat of war, fascism, climate doom, and more. But this feeling that things are out of control and that we're edging closer to the apocalypse, this is not actually new. Every generation has assumed they're living through end times, probably because we realize that human beings make a lot of mistakes. And sometimes, those mistakes can cause cataclysms at a mass scale. Today, we're taking a dive into some of America's biggest screw-ups. We look at how they unfolded through clumsiness and stupidity, how disasters were somehow averted at the last minute, and what lessons we can take away from it all. That's all coming up on this episode of Lever Time.
This just in, editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, Jeffrey Goldberg, says he was accidentally texted war plans.
Earlier this year, America's top national security officials made a bit of a mistake, if you can believe it.
This seems like something out of a farce, like out of a comedy.
It is just stunning on so many different levels. And I understand why Goldberg didn't believe it was real, because it is just shocking in several different ways.
Perhaps you remember the so-called Houthi PC small group. That was the name of the 19-person Signal group chat that accidentally included The Atlantic magazine's Jeffrey Goldberg. In the chat, the Trump administration officials discussed timing and strategy for attacking the Iran-aligned rebel group, the Houthis. Using Goldberg's screenshots, The Atlantic published the signal messages, and what followed was an explosion of outrage in Washington.
Director Radcliffe, this was a huge mistake, correct?
No.
A national political...
Hold on.
No, you
Let me
hold
answer.
on. No, Director Radcliffe, I asked you a yes or no question, and now you'll hold on.
Now, in the long arc of history, this gaffe is a drop in the ocean. There are endless examples of our government making mistakes, or as we'll be calling them in this episode, SNAFUs. Let's start there. What the heck is a SNAFU? And where did that word even come from?
Well, of course, it's an acronym that stands for Situation Normal All Fucked Up.
Recognize that voice? That's Ed Helms, or as many of us know him, Andy Bernard, from the television sitcom The Office.
It has a military origin. You know, it was coined by World War II soldiers. But I feel like it applies very well to kind of grand geopolitical or institutional fuck-ups.
SNAFU is also the name of Ed Helms' podcast that explores history's greatest screw-ups. Its first season was the thrilling and mind-blowing story of something called Able Archer 83. That's the 1983 NATO training exercise that simulated a military response to a hypothetical Soviet attack. The Soviet Union misinterpreted the simulated response as a real buildup for a real attack on their country. The whole thing almost touched off an actual nuclear war. Like me, Ed Helms is kind of a history nerd and has this innate desire to try to understand things by putting them in context, by zooming out to see the bigger picture. Looking back at a lot of the history he reviews, I can't help but feel, well, helpless. As average citizens, we're forced to trust the people who control the levers of power. We have to hope that they won't do anything too crazy and that they'll learn from their mistakes. Because, of course, Able Archer was not the only time we've been dangerously close to Armageddon.
This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island.
We got out of that near miss, the Cuban Missile Crisis, unscathed, but it was yet another reminder of just how precarious our world is, which is something most of us don't really like to talk about. A lot of us sense unseen forces controlling things from behind the scenes. We imagine the world of the TV show House of Cards, where master mustache-twirling manipulators are moving the levers of power and controlling everything.
Power is a lot like real estate. It's all about location, location, location. The closer you are to the source, the
higher property value.
House of Cards is a fictional world where super smart guys are running the show from behind the curtain. And that's certainly a reality in many situations. The Levers podcast series Master Plan is about the secret, well-planned schemes shaping our reality. And as bad as those plots can be, there is a certain comfort in assuming that, hey, at least someone, even an evil person, is in control. But there's plenty of evidence to suggest that we also live in the world depicted in Veep, the HBO sitcom where politicians and power brokers are running around not knowing what's going on, constantly screwing up, accidentally edging us closer and closer to catastrophe and losing control of their faculties.
The level of incompetence in this office is staggering. Mr. Burton, I am so sorry. We're having a complicated day here.
This world of screw-ups and accidents can be funny, but it can also be terrifying. It's a reminder of a riff on an old saying, keep calm, nothing is under control. That's one of the through lines in Ed Helms' reporting on SNAFUs, which he's turned into a full-blown franchise. Earlier this year, he published a book that highlights some of the wildest SNAFUs from each decade in American history. And as a comedic actor, Ed Helms has played countless roles where things seem to be going wrong.
I graduated from anger management the same way I graduated from Cornell, on time. Now I'm back, got a second chance, and I'm not going to blow it. So look out, Dunder Mifflin!
You could say Ed Helms has become a bit of an expert, so I invited Ed onto Lever Time to learn more about his takeaways from researching some of our biggest fuck-ups. We discuss how our species has somehow survived our own mistakes, and what we can learn from those mistakes to make sure we remain resilient amid all the chaos. After the break, Ed Helms takes me deep into Cold War tunnels under the ice in Greenland. He also shows me plans to blow up the moon, and more of the most absurd and life-threatening mistakes in history. Welcome back to Lever Time. Today, I'm talking with actor, comedian, and SNAFU expert Ed Helms. Clearly, there's a boundary between something being a snafu and something being a disaster.
Sure.
I think we're still on the snafu side of things as opposed to absolute disaster. And so that does bring up one story that came up, which was the Project Iceworm story. People have been hearing a lot about Greenland in the news because Donald Trump has considered, I guess, some kind of takeover of Greenland. Apparently, we had done our own mini takeover or attempted mini takeover of Greenland called Project Iceworm. Tell us a little bit about that and what happened with it.
Well, it's a really wild Cold War story. And I'll start by sort of explaining the cover story for Project Iceworm, because that's kind of what the public understood at the time, which was Camp Century. And Camp Century was a very sort of public government operation, the gist of which was to just do scientific research into the viability of structures under the ice sheet of Greenland, doing some climate research and this, that, and the other. That was all an elaborate cover story for Project Iceworm, which was a feasibility study by the military to see if they could dig tunnels and basically build a military base under the ice sheet with tunnels that stretched all over Greenland so that they could put railroad tracks in there and move nuclear missiles anywhere they wanted on the country of Greenland and have first strike against the Soviet Union. Of course, with the Cold War raging, everyone was looking for a nuclear upper hand, and Greenland was extremely strategically valuable, as it is today. It's the reason why Trump is still talking about it. It was a snafu for a number of reasons, probably the biggest of which was that nature always wins, right? You can't just... It turns out that ice is just not a very good structural material for mechanical viability of your structures.
So safe to say the rebel base in Empire Strikes Back on Hoth would not have really worked all that well.
I mean, I feel like their technology was a little bit better, and they also benefit from being fiction. They also put a nuclear reactor in there just to power the base, and this had its own whole set of problems. It created a ton of nuclear waste, as any nuclear reactor does. The U.S. promised to dispose of that nuclear waste. We didn't. We left it there.
Shocker.
It's now frozen under the ice.
Shocker.
There's thousands of gallons of sewage from the hundreds of military workers there that is also frozen under the ice. Climate change will very soon probably reveal all of this again, but it's just sitting there frozen.
So the cover story, we're doing research here. That's the situation normal. The trying to put nuclear weapons in a railroad and a nuclear reactor, that's the fucked up part. I see where we're going here with SNAFUs.
Yeah, it was kind of a boondoggle. I mean, it was incredibly expensive, labor intensive. It cost us a lot of goodwill with Denmark. The Danish government was pretty furious when they realized what was really going on.
There is a theme in your book about weapons, in particular SNAFUs surrounding nuclear weapons, which is actually terrifying as like a sort of a through line, that sort of fuck ups seem to be happening a lot around the weapons that could blow up the entire planet. There was another story that you tell about the United States planning to, or at least exploring the idea of nuking the moon, which sounds absurd, but apparently that was like a real thing that we considered, to like nuke the moon.
So real.
Tell us why.
Well, this is another Cold War beauty. During the Cold War, the Cold War didn't bring out the best in us. The Air Force went deep into research on how to detonate a nuclear missile on the moon. And it was just a flex. The whole thing was just a flex to kind of show the Soviets how badass we were. Everyone is looking for the upper hand, looking for ways to scare our opponents. No one wants to really launch a nuclear missile at each other because of mutually assured destruction. But everyone's looking for ways to just scare each other and get the upper hand. So the thought emerges in apparently a very serious meeting, which to me sounds much more like a comedy writer's room. But
right, can you imagine this meeting?
Right, they're just like, where can we blow something up that will really scare the Soviets? And somebody was just like, the moon. I bet we can hit the moon. and they put a ton of resources into this, lots of research. One of the researchers was the great Carl Sagan, a young Carl Sagan just out of grad school, which I love. Incredible detail. You think Carl Sagan loves planets, right? But now he's researching how to blow one up. But no, so the thinking is that if they can detonate a nuclear missile on the moon, on the surface of the moon, it will be visible from Earth and it will be utterly terrifying, and perhaps leave a scar on the moon that's like a visible reminder of the might of the US military. There's so many problems with this, and thank God they did their research and it was averted. They didn't actually go through with this. A couple of the problems were that they realized that any minor miscalculation or malfunction could very easily result in this nuclear missile missing its target and just slingshotting around the gravitational field of the moon and coming right back to Earth. Obviously, that would be bad. The other thing they realized after extensive research was that this nuclear detonation, even if they hit the target on the surface of the moon, would result in very little more than just a big poof of a dust cloud. And that wouldn't have the kind of bone-rattling fear impact that we hoped that it would. So this plan was thankfully aborted, but not before tons and tons of money and time and research went into it. And it's a funny little bruise on Carl Sagan's legacy, because so many of these snafus, no one's held responsible. They're kind of buried in secrecy, government secrecy. The only reason we know about this is because of a biographer who was working on Carl Sagan's biography, found a fellowship application from that time period that Carl Sagan had filled out, and he had listed this project on his resume, basically. And they were like, hold on. I got to put this Carl Sagan research aside and find out what the hell is going on here with this crazy Wile E. Coyote plan.
One other, closer to the current time period, the Hawaiian missile alert, which I think a lot of people who are listening to this probably remember. Just remind folks about that missile alert that wasn't really an alert.
Yeah, this one's really chilling. I mean, it also is kind of funny in hindsight, but boy, was it insane. The state of Hawaii, which is precariously situated right between North Korea and the United States, like right in the middle, had a early warning system for missile attacks from North Korea. As you may recall, during the first Trump administration, there was a lot of kind of combative rhetoric going on. I mean, eventually they, of course, were sending each other love letters, but there was a lot of tension there.
Yeah, there was the tweet that Trump was like, I could just push my button on the something about the button on his desk that was bigger.
Yeah, you got to have a big button. I mean,
right,
that button.
That's how big your bomb is.
If the button's not big, it's not going to do much damage, right? Hawaii had this warning system, and somebody was implementing a routine test of the system. They clicked the wrong thing on their computer screen and accidentally sent a real missile attack warning to the entire state of Hawaii. So everyone in Hawaii got this alert on their cell phones that just said, a missile is coming to Hawaii right now, and we'll be here.
Take cover.
Yeah, we'll be here in 20 minutes. I think in the sort of post-accident analysis, they realized that those buttons were not clear enough and maybe a little too close together on the computer screen. But I also will say that every time that bubble pops up on my computer screen, I have a tiny little panic attack. I don't know what.
Totally.
And so, like, if the stakes are that high and you're having a tiny little panic attack, like even just the little human response that we don't control is just sort of like, okay, now I definitely have to hit the right button. There's a very good chance that your judgment is clouded or that your hand is trembling or something.
After the break, I ask Ed Helms to dig into some of the psychological reasons that we keep finding ourselves in these potentially world-ending snafus, namely the brink of nuclear war. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Lever Time. We interviewed Annie Jacobson about nuclear war. She's an investigative journalist about sort of how nuclear weapons get launched. And she talks a lot about how the system is so frictionless. They don't want to put anything in between, hitting the button and the missiles launching. And, I bet there is something to that in a situation like this where the system is set up to make the decision quickly. It's not set up to be like, yo, wait a minute, are you sure you want to make that decision? Right. So like then you get a missile launch warning that scares the shit out of everybody in an entire state. That is a wild one. And it raises a question, a sort of meta question about these snafus. In reading your book, I noticed that there's like different kinds of snafus. There's like the taking it way too far snafu, like the radioactive chemistry kit.
Sure.
The CIA guy who buys all the LSD, right? You're just taking it too far. And I think that's related to the mad scientist plans that get averted, like bombing the moon. There's a sort of catastrophe, like the Cuyahoga River catching on fire, and then something good comes out of that, environmental laws. There's also like botched plans, like you just screwed it up, like the attempts to assassinate Castro, right? These are the genres. The point that you made about people being disconnected from the consequences of their actions, right? Like if a president can't kill one person, how can they push a button to kill millions of people, right? It's getting at this idea of disconnection. And I wonder if that's one of the through lines, if that megalomania is sort of part of the problem.
I love where you're going. Absolutely, there is a disconnection. There are many. There's a matrix of disconnections. One of the biggest ones that I think emerges as you read SNAFU, and particularly a lot of these government institution SNAFUs, and I include the military and CIA, in that there's a kind of closed bubble group think, and that's what fosters detachment from either real world consequences and results, but also when you're in a feedback loop like that, and you're in a room of people who are just brainstorming a single outcome, like in many cases, it's just to win the Cold War or scare the Soviets. That's the single outcome. It starts to justify insanity, like crazy ideas. And this is another kind of detachment that I think is really critical, is a detachment from ethics and a detachment from moral considerations. And that is so prevalent throughout my book SNAFU, but also just throughout any a sort of historical analysis and present day analysis. I think we're seeing it now a lot. There's this very creepy detachment, in my opinion, from the just rocket advancement of artificial intelligence and like what it may or may not do. And it very much draws a powerful connection to the nuclear arms race. Like we're in this moment where China and the United States and others, the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, are all trying to just advance artificial intelligence just to beat the other countries. And we have no idea the consequences.
Right. I mean, and that hyper competition.
Yes.
It's like a sort of pissing contest. But I also think part of the silver lining of the book is that a lot of these, or at least some of these plans, were averted, right? Let's nuke the moon. Okay, we didn't nuke the moon. We were pulled back from a really ridiculous, dumb, dangerous idea. I wonder if in your research you found any through lines as to what elements existed in these situations where there was finally a break, right? Can we learn that, okay, one way to avert the worst kinds of snafus is to make sure this or that kind of guy is there, or this or that kind of check is there, right? Is there any lessons to be learned from that?
There are always lessons to be learned. I don't know that they can be sort of boiled down to a logistical or practical kind of step to inject into a process. What you were saying before is the thing to avoid, which is groupthink. Because a lot of times, like with this nuking of the moon, I think it just basically ran out of money. So they could have perfected this. They could have gotten it to a point technologically where it was doable. When it starts to hit boondoggle status, that's where the sort of government purse watchers are like, it's time to nix this one.
Right, which is not reassuring. I mean, I have this ongoing debate about whether the government is more like Veep or more like House of Cards. Veep is this, like, everyone's running around, nobody has any idea what they're doing, and things can get completely out of control.
Yeah.
And then House of Cards, of course, is like everything's 4 steps under control. There's like a man behind the curtain.
Yeah.
I've worked in political campaigns. I've worked in government. I think it's much more like Veep.
Yeah.
In reading SNAFU, I think it's sort of evidence of that. And yet you have a positive takeaway in this book from all of these near disasters. And your takeaway is sort of that we've survived this up until now. So that should give us some kind of confidence that, like, okay, there's always going to be snafus, and, you know, past is essentially predictive. But I'm haunted by, and I bet a lot of listeners are haunted by, the idea that if the government is fucking up as much as it has, and we've gotten this close, that at some point we're not going to be pulled back from the brink. So could you talk me down from that?
I sort of fight the impulse in myself to just go full doomsday and just fall into that pit of terror about any number of things, whether it's the nuclear threat, which is more alive than it ever was right now, or climate change, or just global conflict, global instability, the marching onslaught of artificial intelligence. It is very easy to allow oneself to spin out, but I do think that humanity has shown just an incredible resilience, and it's kind of a choice to focus on that. Our anxieties are not a choice, but we can remember, and I think look back on all of these snafus and many others, and just sort of realize that when that boulder splashed into the pond, it made huge waves in that moment. Those waves and ripples have faded, and culture, society tends to find another equilibrium. There are massive disruptions. There are massive upsets. You hope that you've timed your existence to kind of fit between the waves. But I also think that it is valuable to remember that humanity has persevered through just incredibly scary and wild and weird times.
Coming up, Ed Helms and I discuss why learning about snafus and being a comedian has helped him avoid going full doomsday, and actually has made him feel hopeful. That's after the break. Welcome back to Lever Time. I do take your point in the book that absolutely, that the fact that these were real screw-ups, in some cases with real consequences, but we made it through, does exude a resilience. I think one thing that makes your book and your podcast so thought-provoking is that it is a reminder that we like to tell ourselves that everything is completely under control, and that what we really need to get to as a mindset is actually, again, stay calm. Nothing's under control. I'm just curious what drew you to make that kind of dive down into these rabbit holes? What drew you to basically this kind of important and lost history?
That's a great question. I think it's a couple of things for me. Coming up through comedy in particular, I think comedians and comedy writers, people who work in comedy, develop a kind of reflex to spot what's wrong and to just see the darkness all around us. And then that kind of weird spidey sense is then morphed into, well, how can I point this out in a funny or absurd way or satirical way? It's certainly what we did on The Daily Show. And I think that reflex, that muscle got so highly trained that I just am drawn to that. I'm drawn to fuck ups. I'm drawn to things that are going wrong. And I also have this weird, powerful sense of justice in me. I don't know where it comes from, but I am like kind of preoccupied with fairness and justice. And so many of these snafus or faceplants throughout history have a sort of baked in sense of injustice or mistreatment. And so combining all of that, wanting to do something that still was funny and kind of exercised my comedy muscles and excited my comedy muscles, snafus just felt like a very natural place to start to focus. We seem to be entering this cultural moment where a lot of our cultural leadership is turning away from history, turning away from the study of history, and particularly the study of mistakes, even the acknowledgement of mistakes. There's this weird warped idea that patriotism means denying all the bad things that we ever did as a country, or just burying them or never talking about them because they make people feel guilty or make people feel insecure. Ironically, to me, that is the weakest possible stance. Whereas the really powerful, strong backbone form of leadership is to look back at mistakes, own them, and then take pride in the resilience that emerged from those mistakes, take pride in the lessons learned from those mistakes, and really trumpet those things, but to always hold your mistakes as badges of your self-education, either individually as a person or certainly culturally as a nation. And I find it so heartbreaking that so much of our difficult history as a country is being treated as disposable, and even that disposing of it is somehow necessary to also having national pride. I'm incredibly proud to be American. It's not to say we don't have a lot of work to do, but I think we've managed to work through some really terrible episodes. And again, there are more lessons to keep learning.
I'm so glad to hear you say that. At the heart of what this society is supposed to be is that striving for, I mean, it almost sounds like cheesy. And there almost should be like West Wing music before as I say it, but like a more perfect union. The whole point is like to get a more perfect union, you have to be like, oh, we really, we've screwed out. That didn't go that well. And we shouldn't do that again. I do think that is a big takeaway from this, which is that looking back on the errors we made and trying to glean lessons from that is how we become a better society. I mean, look, we are living in an era where we have essentially memory hold things like the decisions that led us into the Iraq War. I mean, like lying about WMD is like the biggest snafu maybe of our generation, right? We're in a culture that doesn't want to look back at that. And I think comedy in a lot of ways helps us to look back without it. It makes it like safer a little bit
for sure
to look back on these things. So one final question then, put yourself 20 years in the future. If you could be in the room when a snafu is unfolding, right? All the lessons you've learned, right? And whatever hypothetical you want to come up with, are there some basic sort of universal principles that you would say to the decision makers who are in the middle of fucking up?
Wow. I love that question. Just off the top of my head, listening to legitimate scientific evidence and or inquiry on the subject, like evidence-based, peer-reviewed science, to me is an incredibly valuable resource for any decision maker in a tricky situation. I would also say gather the smartest people that you can from disparate backgrounds. When we were talking about these Cold War decisions that were so insane, that was a very small circle of people, relatively speaking, with all that came into an institution with a similar mindset and were sort of brought into a kind of group think. That is very dangerous in a crisis situation. So it's important to have people from competing backgrounds, competing points of views. Probably the hardest thing is to make sure you have the balls to make the hard decisions. The weight of the decisions of our leaders in these moments is utterly terrifying. It is massive. And certain people just have that mettle. And you got to be honest with yourself if you're kind of getting to a point of leadership in that space, whether or not you can make those decisions. Listen to good data. Find a team that's going to respect each other, but not necessarily agree, and from disparate backgrounds, and then just look inward and make sure you have the guts to do what needs to be done.
I mean, honestly, like when you said the second one, that sort of team of rivals in our history, people who've made what we think of as really great decisions, brought in people to challenge their thinking. That one is the one I feel like, well, yes, making a tough decision, but I want my potential decisions to be challenged before I make those decisions. I don't just want yes people around me.
Of course.
Right. And I feel like we're in a culture that self-selects for yes people, not people who are like, wait a minute, I'm not sure you want to make that decision. A lot of these situations that get out of control, I feel like you're right. It's groupthink. It's the old, what they call the best and brightest, the people who were that small circle that made the decisions for the Vietnam War, et cetera, et cetera. We could talk about this for hours. I just want to thank you so much for taking time with us. Thank you for writing this book. And thank you for bringing comedy to such a serious subject, because I really do think it actually helps more people get exposed to like really serious things. I've been a huge fan of your work. I hope that you continue down this path, because I think it's really great. Ed Helms, thanks so much. It's great to meet you.
I really appreciate all that. This has been a blast. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Lever Time. You can check out the book SNAFU by Ed Helms at a bookstore or a library near you. Lever Time is a production of The Lever. This episode was produced by Natalie Bettendorf. It was edited and mixed by Ron Doyle. Our theme music is by Nick Campbell. You can subscribe to Lever Time on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, the PRX mobile app, or wherever you get your podcasts. For ad-free episodes, exclusive bonus content, and access to The Lever's entire archive of investigative journalism, please consider becoming a premium subscriber. Head over to levernews.com to learn more about becoming a paid subscriber, or click the link in the episode's show notes. I'm David Sirota. We'll be back later this week with another episode of Lever Time.